Welcome into the Leaving Eden podcast. Welcome in. We're here to talk about cults. We're talking about fundamentalism. We're talking about religion and everything related to those topics. Sadie Carpenter, she is here. She's your host. She's a cult expert. She's a cult survivor. She was raised in the fundamentalist church. My name's Gabi Hakohen. Once again, this show is available wherever you get your podcast and also on YouTube. Be sure to subscribe over there because once we get to 10,000 subscribers, we're going to do a big deep dive on the cult that Sadie was raised in, a full-length docuseries. And if you want to see that, make sure you share the show, family, friends, coworkers, anyone who you think would like it. Sadie.
Yes.
What is it that we are talking about today?
So I want to talk about the early church and everything that we do and mostly don't know about it.
Fundamentalism, like we talked about last week, the idea behind it is we need to get back to the way things were in the first century.
Right. So okay, what is that way that you're talking about? What were things like in the first century? And the answer is we don't know.
If you're a Christian, you would point to like the book of Acts, right? Which is the Acts of the Apostles.
Right.
To get an idea of what were people doing in the 1 to 2 generations, specifically after Jesus died, when the church was first growing throughout the Roman Empire, and written about the people who were living in Judea, Samaria, Syria, Turkey, Greece, Rome in the first century AD as they attempt to spread the gospel throughout the Roman Empire.
Yeah, so it's very much a question of what do we know about the early church? And often the answer is not very much at all. So there was a dude named Jesus, possibly. There were probably a lot of guys named Jesus around the time. I have a guest who wants to come on pretty soon who has some more deep research about whether Jesus was a real guy or not, but that's for another time. What we know is that there was this somewhat popular new religious movement that was spreading from, somewhere, probably Jerusalem, associated with a bunch of guys who were mostly probably real, and claimed to know this one guy, Jesus, who was possibly real. And also this one guy, Paul, who experts do agree was almost certainly real, unfortunately. Although he didn't write all the stuff that people say he wrote. So the apostles were following Jesus around before leading up to his death. Jesus died, was buried, rose again, and spent 40 more days with the apostles after his death and resurrection. At the end of those 40 days, Jesus ascended into heaven and gave the apostles the Great Commission, which is where he commands them to go into all nations and preach the gospel to every creature. After that, Jesus disappears into the clouds, and the apostles are confused. Okay, what's next? And he said he's coming back, but when is he coming back? So the apostles most likely believed that the return of Jesus was going to be much sooner than modern Christians perceive it to be. The apostles believed that they were living in the last days before Jesus would return. They thought he would come back in a year, not 2,000 years and counting.
Why did they think that?
Because Jesus said, I will come again. Another thing that Jesus said was Matthew 24:34. Jesus said, truly, I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all of these things have happened. And the things that he was talking about were the destruction of the temple. But at the same time, he was talking about the destruction of the temple, which did happen in 70 AD. So about 37 years later. The people who heard him talking at the time thought he also meant his own return. So he said, the temple's going to be destroyed and I'm going to return. And this generation will not pass away until all of these things have taken place. The temple did get destroyed less than 40 years later. And then Jesus didn't return less than 40 years later, which was kind of confusing.
So how do you reconcile these two things and you build a religious movement based on that?
I think that's where Paul comes in.
Very interesting religious figure. He can represent a lot of different things to different people depending on who you are and what you want to see in him.
That is a very good way of putting it. So Paul was working for the Roman government in these very, very early days of Christianity, like the first less than 50 years. Paul was traveling around throughout Judea, Samaria, those areas that you mentioned, looking for secret churches of Christians that he could round up and like kind of literally send to the gladiators or the lions. He was, by all accounts, a pretty intense guy. One day Paul, the legend has it, that one day Paul was riding his horse down the road to Damascus. So he was on his way over to Damascus to find some more Christians to round up and feed to the lions when he was stopped by a very bright light. And this light shone down on Paul and his horse. And the light was so bright that it blinded Paul. And out of this massive beam of light, a voice spoke to Paul and said, "I'm God, and Jesus was the Messiah, and you should stop killing Christians." Obviously, this scared the heck out of Paul. So he took some time to chill out and then became the most prolific evangelist and spreader of Christianity. Instead of traveling from place to place looking for Christians to round up and feed to the lions, what Paul started doing instead was traveling from place to place, visiting early churches and early gatherings of Christians. And this very quickly devolved into Paul just telling them what to think about everything. Because it's Paul. So this is where the story gets a little bit tricky because Paul was almost certainly historically real. But we don't know which ones of the texts that are ascribed to him he actually wrote. So in the New Testament, Paul is responsible for, I think, about 33% of the total writing in the New Testament. The letters that are ascribed to Paul typically are Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, and Philemon. The scholarly view tends to be that Paul wrote some of these earlier books. So the scholarly thought is typically that Paul wrote 1st Thessalonians, Galatians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Romans, Philippians, and Philemon. Paul maybe, but probably didn't write 2nd Thessalonians, Ephesians, and Colossians. And then the scholarly view is that Paul did not write 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, and probably not Acts either.
And most of these books, they're basically instructions to what the church should do.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's a letter that he would have written to a church. So Thessalonians would be a letter that was written to a church in Thessalonica. And it would be something that he would write to these churches to tell them, this is what you're doing wrong. This is what you're doing right. This is what you should be doing.
Right, exactly. Like if you pull up 1st Thessalonians, and I'm reading from NIV because that's what my computer defaulted to this morning.
I'm going to put this up here in KJV because that's copyright free and we can use it.
Oh, right. Hold on. Do I need to change it?
I don't know. I think it would be very funny if we got copyright struck on
by the
YouTube for using the wrong Bible translation.
I feel like that would not happen, but also
no,
it might because YouTube copyright stuff is kind of crazy.
Yeah. Will it trigger their content ID thing if you use a Bible translation? That isn't KJV.
So I switched over to King James because you scared me. But the King James, 1 Thessalonians 1, Paul and Silvanus and Timotheus, unto the church of the Thessalonians, which is in God the Father and in the Lord Jesus Christ. Grace be unto you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. We give thanks to God always for all of you, always for you all, making mention of you in our prayers, remembering without ceasing your work of faith and labor of love and patience of hope in our Lord Jesus Christ in the sight of God and our Father, knowing, brethren, beloved, your election of God. So it's just a letter. It's Paul traveling around doing Paul stuff and then writing letters back to his friends, fans, and followers in these different churches in Thessalonia, in Ephesus, in these different cities around the area that he was traveling in.
I mean, I like to think of him as like he's working for a Big Four consulting company for like management consulting. And he goes around and he's like, this is what you're doing wrong. This is what you're doing right. So
that is kind of very accurate.
Paul out here working for Deloitte or working for McKinsey and Company is
so when we're talking about so I think there's an important distinction here, because the earlier apostles, the other ones, are people who hypothetically met the real, probably real, possibly real guy, Jesus. Whoever and whatever Jesus was, they knew the guy. And then it gets passed to a generation of people who knew the apostles but didn't necessarily know the guy. They never met Jesus. Paul is this interesting middle generation because technically, canon-wise, he did meet Jesus on the road to Damascus, but he never met Jesus as a living human person. So Paul is kind of the weird outlier between generations, because these first generations are otherwise really well defined.
The Leaving Eden podcast is made possible by our audience over on Patreon. I gave it all to your patrons. Your names are Kathleen Moncrief, Melissa Manown, and Todd Dale. Thank you guys so much for subscribing at the I Gave It All tier of our Patreon. We could not do this show without you. Our Faith Promise Missions tier patrons, your names are Jessica Tambo, Linda Morgan, Eleanor Donahue, Jonna Caterwee, Chad Harris, Madeline Cusick, Rob the Methodist, Hannah Ross, Stephanie Johnson, Elizabeth Struther, Tara McNamara, Tiziana Buberini, Janine Collin, Allie Allen, Dora J, Madeline Antrim, Steve and Amy, 1010, Chris, Yafi Levova, Right Away 13, Rob spends pickleball prize dollars on pickled peppers, Sacred Chickens, Helly R, God's Wiener Dog, and Backwoods Barbie 31. Thank you guys so much. We really do appreciate you subscribing at the Faith Promise Missions level of our Patreon. If you want to support the Leaving Eden podcast, you can go over to patreon.com/Leaving Eden podcast. And if you join there, you get access to extended, uncensored, ad-free versions of our episodes. They also come out early. It's a cool thing. You get a behind the scenes look at what it is that we do. There's bonus content over there. So if you like this, you should head over there and check that out. Thank you to everyone who supports us over on Patreon. And thank you to everyone else as well.
We've kept mostly to what the canonical, what is believed by Christians, with a few addendums made by Sadie about.
Right.
The thing I think is interesting about this is I was actually on our social media because I've been posting these short form videos, just clips from our pod. And I posted one about fundamentalism being about trying to get back to the early church, trying to act like people in the book of Acts. And there was one person who commented on this and said something along, they quoted a verse saying about how members of the early church sold all their belongings and used it to provide for everyone. And they were saying something along the lines of, well, they're not actually doing what people think of in the book of Acts, because that would be communism or something. And that
accurate.
Was the gist of
mostly accurate.
What part of this is the thing that fundamentalists take out and are like, this is the thing that they were doing in here, and this is the thing that we want to be doing? Is it the evangelism? Is it the spreading the gospel? What's going on here?
The thing that the fundamentalists are wanting to emulate would be the evangelism, spreading the gospel, and also what they perceive to be the fundamental, unchangeable beliefs of Christianity, which is something that we're about to get into.
And there was also a lot of like litigation around rules, what rules you do and don't have to follow.
Oh yeah, a ton. That was like all they did with their time for a couple decades.
If you read these books, especially like Acts, Corinthians, there is a ton of litigation about like saying you do have to follow this rule, you don't have to. There's a new covenant, old covenant. Do we have to follow all these rules if they're new converts?
Right.
And that's something that what I've seen fundamentalists really point to and say, these are the instructions for us.
So this part of Christian history, nobody really knew what the rules were, and everybody was making things up, and especially Paul. Paul was making the most things up. He was coming up with rules about women covering their heads in the church, or women needing to be silent in church. There are all these additional things that he just kind of came up with, except for the fact that Paul may not have actually come up with those. So a lot of so we've got a reference problem here with the New Testament. The canonical Christian belief is that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the four epistles, were not necessarily distributed shortly after Jesus' death, but that they would all have been written within about 15 years. That they would all have been written within about 50 years of when Jesus died by actual people who actually knew Jesus. That's one possibility. Another possibility is that those gospels could have been rewritten to include the opinions of the apostles who made Christianity famous after Jesus died. So some of the original apostles most likely believed that Jesus was not actually divine. Many of the original apostles believed that Jesus was just like a really, really, really good person who had God's blessing, not necessarily the Son of God, not necessarily born of a virgin. Paul is one of the central figures in turning that around. Paul's letters, where he would set people straight on everything they were doing wrong, from what food they ate to their theological beliefs, were essential to building this doctrine that Jesus was not only divine, but actually the literal Son of God born of a virgin. So we don't know what those early believers would have believed before Paul encountered them. We do know, in some cases, what Paul said to them. Where it gets really tricky and interesting is there is a theory that some of Jesus's words in the Gospels may have been retconned over time to reflect Paul's words better, to give Paul more credibility. So what this theory is saying is Jesus said something. Later on, Paul, who never met Jesus in person, comes through and says something different. And then a transcriber of the gospel in which Jesus is recorded saying that thing goes back and changes what it says in the gospel to match Paul. It's like a Wikipedia article referencing itself kind of problem.
What is the evidence towards this? Is there earlier versions that don't have these, that have sections written differently that we know of?
So one of the things that points to this is writing style. People who have analyzed the writing style of both epistles and the Gospels have believed that each of these books had multiple authors. There will be just a paragraph added in. Famously, the paragraph where Paul says that women should be silent in church and cover their heads in church is supposedly a very different writing style and not attributed to Paul at all. There's weird and unpredictable stuff, for sure. Evidence for the Gospels maybe having been edited to include Paul's opinions would be that Paul would, thinking about when these things were written, Paul most likely did not have access to the Gospels at all. So when Paul says, Jesus said this thing, there are only a few places that Paul could legitimately get that information, right? He could get that information from talking to Jesus himself, and Jesus says, hey, yo, when I was on earth, I said this thing. Or Paul can get that information from the Gospels, which are not written yet. So where is Paul getting this information? And is it possible when things from the Pauline epistles and things from the Gospels line up so well? The theory is that somebody read Paul's epistle where Paul said Jesus said XYZ and then went and wrote that back into the Gospel account to legitimize Paul.
Or it could have been an honest mistake where they say, sure, well, he said this thing and we know this guy, he's really credible, but it isn't in here. We should make sure that that part is in, just, to make sure it like.
Right. And if you're into the whole divine inspiration thing, that makes a lot of sense. Because if God can divinely inspire the Bible when Moses or John wrote it, why can't he divinely inspire the Bible when Paul wrote it? What's really fascinating is that these letters from Paul were just kind of just that. They were just letters. They were just Paul's very strong opinions and big feelings about what should be going on. So these letters got passed around from place to place over a very long period of time. And these are all the dudes who, for lack of a better term, knew a guy. These are the dudes who knew Jesus, or in Paul's case, or in the case of somebody like Timothy. So Timothy was a pastor within the early church. He was Paul's mentor, Paul's protege, Paul's successor in a lot of ways. And Paul writes to and from and about him a lot in the Pauline epistles. Timothy never had a chance to meet Jesus. Paul, questionable. So Paul was like, hey, I know a guy. And then Timothy starts the I know a guy who knows a guy era.
You know someone like that?
Let's just say I know a guy who knows a guy who knows another guy. Let me make some calls, see if I can get you a meeting.
Another thing about the epistles in the New Testament, I think they're so often portrayed as being something that was totally cohesive. This is what the early church believed, it is this thing. And that's wild to me. Because the early church was not just one single group that agreed on everything from the beginning. There were several sects that split off from early Christianity in the 1st and 2nd century. One of them that's pretty well known is Gnosticism, and I'll be short, I promise. But Gnosticism is a brain baby of Christianity with some Greek philosophy, born in Alexandria. Gnosticism disagrees with Christianity on a lot of very major theological issues, like original sin and the specifics of the deity of Christ. It's very different from the Christianity that we might be familiar with. So in the past, I've called Gnosticism a Betamax to Christianity's VHS. And
really?
Yeah.
That's funny.
I still think that's a pretty good, pretty good analogy. The texts regarding Gnosticism were lost for a really long time and rediscovered a little bit less than 100 years ago. The prevailing theory about why those texts were lost was that the Bishop of Rome at some point may have made Gnosticism illegal, so possibly people buried their texts to hide them. No one knows quite for sure. What we do know for sure is that the time between Jesus ascending into heaven and around 385 AD was the I know a guy who knows a guy era, and it was the we still have not got any of this figured out era of Christianity. The people, like you said, people were rules lawyering a lot, mostly Paul. People were asking a million questions to which they didn't feel like they had any answers. And what I definitely did not understand growing up as a kid in church is how much of what we learned was related to these early church dudes. Like, I did not know that the Council of Nicaea, where the Nicaean Creed was set down, which the majority of Christians still agree with or adhere to, was not the only time there was an argument. I kind of thought there was like one big fight at Nicaea and then that was the end of it. But this is not actually what happened. What actually happened is that the apostles and leaders within the early church fought for literal decades about all of these topics, like the divinity of Christ, the hypostatic union, how salvation works, all those sort of things. So we're talking about the I know a guy era of Christianity, and now we're heading into the I know a guy who knows a guy era. And I want to talk about Origen. Origen is one of the people who my snake's middle names are after. And he's kind of a cool figure in early Christian history. So Origen was born in Alexandria to Christian parents in 185 CE. So specifically someone who was born in between the 100-year mark of the destruction of the Second Temple and the 100-year mark of the Book of Revelation being published or written. Origen's father was Leonaidas of Alexandria. He was martyred in 202 CE, according to Eusebius, who was a historian and theologian, who we also probably need to talk about. The church tradition holds that the Apostle Mark, the author of the book Mark, went to Alexandria around 48 CE and was martyred there. So that also stays within that like roughly 100 years framework. Leonidas wasn't old enough to have met Mark, but Mark's death and Leonidas's birth were not that far apart. It's totally possible that someone who knew Mark did influence Leonidas, who influenced his son Origen, and all of that is fully hypothetical. But what I'm trying to illustrate is the know a guy who knows a guy phase. Because if you're Origen, your dad is a Christian minister, your dad never knew Jesus, but your dad knew Mark, and Mark was one of the apostles. So that connection is very strong. A lot stronger than the connections now going over like 2,000 years. As a young writer, the reason I really respect Origen is as a young writer, he was a futurist, a universalist. His views on Revelation were very progressive by that day's standards. And by the end of his life...
What does that mean?
Like...
So universalism is the idea that salvation is available to everyone. That no one, that because of Jesus' sacrifice, no one is going to hell.
Right.
That everyone worldwide is applicable to get into heaven.
Right. And by the end of his life, Origen was an Orthodox partial preterist.
And so Futurism is the belief that the book of Revelation, which it was written by John of Patmos, and is allegorical to both the destruction of the temple, but is also believed by many to be a prophecy of what will come in the end of days. And the futurist belief is that will happen in the future, that is something that has not happened yet.
Right, correct. And then the preterist view is the view that it has mostly happened, right?
Or that there is something that is ongoing and that we're living through it, but it has happened this is when it happened, and there are parts of it that are still ongoing.
Yeah, preterism is an eschatological view, interpreting prophecies as fulfilled in the past. So Origen was not ever old enough to have known the guy, but he knew a guy, his dad, who knew a guy, Apostle Mark, potentially, who knew a guy, and that's Jesus. Origen believed that these prophecies had already come to pass earlier in his life. And later in his life, Origen vocally changed his teachings, which I think is really interesting. There are other early church fathers like Eusebius, who was a direct philosophical descendant of Origen. Eusebius was bishop of Caesarea in the time of the Council of Nicaea, and he was in support of Arius. So Arianism, not Arianism, teaches that Jesus is subordinate to God the Father. So it's not the same as like oneness Pentecostalism, which argues that Jesus isn't a separate person at all. Our Arianism teaches that Jesus was divine, but also God is in charge of him all the time. So this is where things devolve to from the era of the early apostles of like, I know a guy, to the I know a guy who knows a guy area.
Leading up to the Council of Nicaea, there's a lot of disparate beliefs. There's people are questioning, what is Jesus? Like, how does his divinity work?
Right. What are magnets and how do they work? What is Jesus and how does he work? And how does divinity work? And how does salvation work?
Because in Jewish theology, at least, or in Jewish tradition, a figure like Jesus doesn't really exist. The closest thing to somebody like him would be like King David. The way that Christians portray Jesus, the closest thing would be somebody like King David or somebody like that. But King David couldn't actually go out and perform miracles. He was just somebody who had God's favor.
Right. So something that has to be worked on here is subtly changing the historical definition of who or what the Messiah was supposed to be to fit Jesus in better. And then also subtly changing the idea of what Jesus was to fit the Messiah better. The early church wanted to make that connection to merge Christianity and Judaism into a larger power block. So Paul wrote about the more of the twisting who or what the Messiah is and who or what Judaism is to be more accepting of Jesus. And then the apostles wrote more about massaging the Jesus narrative to make it more messianic. So this led to a lot of disagreement. One thing that I talk about a lot when I talk about the fundamentals or fundamentalists is that they want to go back to the original way things were. They want to go back to what it was in the early church. The really interesting thing is that it wasn't a way in the early church. It wasn't one thing ever.
There wasn't a clear set of instructions for people.
Right.
And they might think that, oh, well, we have these letters. And so, well, they got a letter from Paul, therefore everyone followed it. And that's what they did. But they wouldn't have got the letter from Paul if they weren't doing something different.
Right. And now those letters from Paul are considered biblical canon. But at the time they were not. Those early letters from Paul were just letter. It's literally just Paul's group text that is now life and death to a lot of people.
Yeah.
So it's very unclear if Paul ever meant his words to become scriptural canon. It's very unclear whether anybody was thinking that from the beginning. And then it's unclear what's supposed to be scriptural canon because God hasn't really, told us what's supposed to be scriptural canon, except for when he came down and re-inspired and preserved the King James Version, of course.
But of course, if you're a Christian and you believe this doctrine of verbal inspiration or this doctrine of divine inspiration, then you would believe that even if Paul didn't intend for these letters to become scriptural canon, the inspiration for him writing them was divine because God knew that when Paul wrote it down, that it would eventually become scriptural canon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's the thing. In order for it to be scriptural canon, it cannot have been edited a whole bunch of times over the years. In order for it to be scriptural canon, we have to have some archaeological evidence of the correct dating of this text. And what a lot of scholars think was going on was in this time of around 200 to 300 BC, as tensions are mounting and we're leading up to the Council of Nicaea, it's possible that bishops and translators of the Bible were massaging the narrative a little bit to get what they wanted to have in the canon and in the text. The canon is just the books of the Bible that a lot of the early church accepted or would run with. So we don't know how many letters Paul wrote that didn't end up becoming scriptural canon. We don't know if Paul really did write those letters. What we do know is by the time the 200s came around, there was a lot of debate about all of this stuff, which is why it's not a good idea to say, well, the early church believed this or early church believed that, because they were pretty incohesive. They were all off on their own thing, believing their own thing, editing Paul's letters, editing the apostles' letters. And then we get to a point where some subsets of early Christianity split off. One of those is the Gnostics. Another one of those is Arianism, which I was talking about. Another one of those is people who would later sign on to the Nicene Creed. So the Nicene Creed affirms a person's belief in Jesus Christ as the Son of God and being born of a virgin. And that is the foundation of Christianity since then. I think what's really interesting is how impossible it is to know what happened.
You know what I do think? I think that the fundamentalists did, in fact, get back to the way that things were in the early church.
Because they just fight a lot.
Because all they do, it seems, is fight with themselves and other Christians about what the Bible actually says and what you're supposed to do and what you're not supposed to do.
That's true. I really want to dig more into this early church stuff at a different time. I think it's so fascinating. I'll come back to it when I have more voice.
I do too. I think that, and ideas like this and information like this, while some of it I'm sure is accepted by the fundamentalists being like, and that's how we know it's right, in the same way that you would see members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints saying, well, we know that the Book of Mormon is right because God made him translate it differently the second time.
Right.
So
great. No, I have Book of Mormon stuck in my head. Cool.
I mean, it is interesting to me but if you believe that it is divinely inspired, then that is kind of to use a turn of phrase, a self-fulfilling prophecy, in that if you think all these changes that were, he couldn't say this to these people at this time because they wouldn't have been willing to accept it. So God had him say the thing that he needed to say to them at that time in order to get them to accept it, but then made sure that when they went back and edited it, they edited it the way that it's supposed to be for us now to read, which is an ongoing era and an ongoing time.
Right. And it's very important that that's an ongoing era and that we're not the same as the early church, because some fundamentalists now don't want to be held to the same rules. They just want the street cred.
I don't know. It strikes me as it's very much like a wild, wild west situation of what it is that people actually believe. That.
Yeah. And it was a very different thing at the time to change your opinion too. That was a lot more possible or feasible than it is in the days of social media.
I think also, and you can take this how you will, but I think if you talk to a lot of historians, they will tell you that any text from not just like from any time, from now, but also especially from ancient times, isn't necessarily going to be 100% reliable.
Right.
Because it's going to have the biases of whoever wrote it, and you don't know who that person is, of course.
Right.
Also, there's going to be issues of, is the person who wrote this down actually the person who saw it? Because they might be writing down different accounts that they got from other people who couldn't write, who couldn't read, who were illiterate.
Right.
Third, how much of this is oral tradition that is taken down and is just believed and is included in that as a contextual underpinning that we don't have today?
Yeah.
And so I think that this doesn't necessarily say like this thing that was said is inaccurate. I think that it's saying this thing that was said is reflective of what somebody wanted to be written down at this time. And it's more of a reflection of what these people wanted rather than.
Right. Especially remember that, like, so much of this church tradition stuff isn't in the Bible anyway.
Right. So if you're saying, well, we want to get back to the days of the early church, then looking at what it says in the Bible isn't necessarily the wrong thing to do, because the Bible was compiled and pieced together by the early church to figure out what it was that they wanted to make something that was more cohesive. So if you think, well, this early church is what we want to be for whatever reason, rather than we want to be who we are now, then that's not necessarily the wrong thing to do.
Yeah.
But is that the right thing to do from I'm a person who is alive in the year 2026?
Right. Well, I think I better wrap up for today. I'll come back with more information.
Thank you guys for tuning into this episode. I was fascinated to learn all of this information that you had to tell me. So next week, we're going to talk about this Greek commission that is really the thing that fundamentalists mean when they say we want to be like the early church. And we're going to talk about how that plays out in fundamentalism and how some pretty crazy experiences that Sadie had when she was out soul winning. You won't want to miss that one. It's going to be a lot of fun. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. Make sure to give us a subscribe. Make sure to give us a follow. Tell your friends, tell your neighbors, tell your family. You guys have a great day. Bye-bye.